4 months and 1 day after Hamas's attack on Israel, and even though Gaza has been flattened, neither side seems to want to stop. Benjamin Netanyahu preempting conciliatory noises by the visiting U.S. Secretary of State by announcing months of war ahead, with total victory as the sole option. The head of Israel's most right-wing government ever, helped in his brinkmanship perhaps by Hamas itself, which after nearly 2 weeks of truce efforts has now piled on the demands to a hostage for prisoner exchange deal. Has Qatar been as ineffective with Palestinian militants as the U.S. has with Netanyahu? In the Middle East, two hardliners always win over the moderates, with Israeli guns now bearing down on Gaza's southernmost city, Rafah, and U.S. military and civilian aid caught in the election year gridlock of Capitol Hill back in Washington. Who to break the impasse? Does a breakthrough have to go through the U.S. Capitol? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Benjamin Netanyahu who vows to fight on. With us is journalist and documentary filmmaker Sofia Amara. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We're joined from Washington by Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute. Thanks for being with us.
Always a pleasure.
From Pittsburgh, Colin Clark, research director at risk consultants, the Sufan Group. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to be crossing over to Tel Aviv shortly with Charles Friedrich will be joining us. Your reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. Yeah, a brewing diplomatic frenzy had raised hopes of a very first breather from fighting since the month of November. With Antony Blinken still in town on Wednesday, Benjamin Netanyahu pouring cold water on that concept.
This evening, I want to tell you one thing. We are on the path of total victory. Victory is within reach. It's not a matter of years or decades. It's a matter of months.
Colin Clark, whenever we hear Benjamin Netanyahu speaking, according to what language it is, it's either for a domestic audience or an international audience, right? So here he's speaking Hebrew. Was this just political rhetoric, or is he really saying that whatever's flying is not going to fly?
Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to know exactly how meaningful these remarks are. Although I had an article in Foreign Affairs on Monday where I warned against Israeli mission creep in Gaza. And I think, given Netanyahu's very self-serving politics, it actually behooves him that the war drags on longer, because that's one of the few things that's likely to keep him in office. If the conflict ends, many within Israel who are unhappy with his leadership are likely to move to oust him. So I look at this as very self-serving for Netanyahu. I'm not sure that it benefits the Israelis. It certainly doesn't benefit the Palestinian civilians who are still being killed on a regular basis in Gaza.
We can now, as promised, cross to Tel Aviv. Charles Friedrich is a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor, a senior fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate. We just heard at the top a short clip of Benjamin Netanyahu promising months of war ahead. And you just heard now Colin Clark saying that that's maybe not in the best interest of Israel. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that what has to happen is that the military operation in Gaza has to be completed.
We have a lunch today.
Excuse me?
Go ahead. We're listening.
I say that the military operation in Gaza must be completed. That requires a brief additional time in Khan Yunis, and will then require an operation to really complete, in essence, the takeover of the entire strip in Rafah. And that will probably be a comparatively prolonged operation. But I don't think we're
How
really
prolonged?
No, about maybe weeks. I don't think it's months. The prime minister, as Colin was saying, may have his own political interests in prolonging the war. I hope that's not the case. And I believe that if it turns out that that is the case, both some of the members of his coalition, and I would imagine that even the security establishment will come out in strong opposition to that.
All right, you're saying weeks. Benjamin Netanyahu, who this Thursday has ordered troops to prepare to enter Gaza's southernmost city of Rafah, where civilians have nowhere else to run. Shirley Sitbon has more.
Panic in a tent camp in the city of Rafah. An Israeli strike hit a vehicle only meters away.
We were entertaining the children. Then rockets fell at the entrance of the camp. The shrapnel was propelled towards the children and us as well.
The Israeli army has multiplied attacks in southern Gazan towns and camps. Palestinian and Israeli officials said that a senior Palestinian police officer and Hamas member was killed when his car was struck. At least 3 other people were killed in a house.
We were at home when it happened. We were hit with a missile. There were children there and a cancer patient. We were helping him in his home.
In local hospitals, families mourn loved ones, and everyone fears an even worse situation ahead after the Israeli Prime Minister confirmed that soldiers were told to prepare to fight in Rafah. The U.S. has urged Israel to do everything possible to ensure that civilians are protected. The UN warned against such an escalation.
Such an action would exponentially increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences. It's time for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages.
Expanding the ground offensive to Rafah is worrying because the area is extremely densely populated. Some 1 million people live or have found refuge there. It's also concerning because Rafah is the border crossing through which humanitarian aid is brought into the Gaza Strip. If it's attacked, all Gazans will see their living conditions deteriorate further.
And just a reminder, viewers, Sofia Marad, 2.2 million residents in the Gaza Strip. In the 4 months, they've been first told to evacuate from the north, and effectively the civilians have been pushing south, and this Rafah is the furthest they can go.
Yeah, then there is Egypt.
Whose border is closed.
Yeah, totally closed, and who's not willing to open to let Palestinian refugees inside the strips enter their territory. So it means there is a lot of casualties and suffering waiting, expecting the Palestinians after this announcement of Benjamin Netanyahu to start a big or a massive attack against Rafah, because what's expecting the Palestinian is either, death or to be expelled out of the country, because now there is only Egypt. And there are around 1.3 million inhabitants living in Rafah, or refugees in Rafah. The population of Rafah has been multiplied by 6 since the beginning of the crisis, which means that any strike could provoke a catastrophe, even more than ones that we have been seeing in the north and center of the Strip.
And the question is how tenable it is. Well, for Palestinians, not at all, as you've just said. It's particularly difficult for Israelis who are worrying about the fate of the hostages, more than 100 of them still held in the Gaza Strip. She was kidnapped from the Nir Oz kibbutz on October 7th. Sahar Calderon, among those freed from Gaza the last time, at a press conference Wednesday of former hostages, the 16-year-old Franco-Israeli employed strong graphic language in pleading with the government to put aside qualms about exchanging Palestinian prisoners for those left behind.
And don't talk to me about morality and that we can't give them more terrorists, because you know what? It doesn't matter. There are 135 human beings still breathing who are in horror, and this is not moral. So please save those who are alive, because we won't be able to bring back the dead.
Before I turn to Hussein Ibish, Charles Friedrich, what percentage of the population agrees, would you say, with 16-year-old Sahar?
Look, I think this is one of the most agonizing decisions in Israel's history, because on the one hand, Israelis have a very, very deep commitment to their fellow citizens. It's something that we take very, very, very seriously. And at the same time, we are fighting a war here, an existential war, And we also have to keep track of the national interests that are at play here. It's a hard call to make. What do you do? There's no easy answer here. So I think most people share her deep her pain. Everyone shares her pain, and everybody would like to do whatever they can to bring the people home. But in the end, it can't be at any price. And the proposal that, or the counter proposal that Hamas came up with is viewed by much of the Israeli public as being essentially surrender, and that won't fly.
Yeah, that was Hussein Ibish. We heard you were, when we spoke with you a couple of nights ago, we were watching a press conference by Antony Blinken in Qatar, and you had the strong sense that there'd been a counteroffer, you had proved right, and that counteroffer really raised the ante. Why?
Yeah, it was as expansive as I suggested on your program. It would be filled with Palestinian prisoners of what Israelis regard as the worst variety, and also demanding, not just a much longer ceasefire, 135 days, but also a framework for ending the conflict. It's not an offer designed to be accepted. I think much as anyone who seriously looked at the Paris proposal understood that there was no way that Hamas was going to accept it, even though they would have been wise to do so, that they weren't likely to accept it at least without including a Palestinian prisoner release. And, at this point, I think it's very hard to avoid concluding that both Netanyahu and Yahya Sinwar, who we're just looking at on your screen, are having a very good time with this war and are thoroughly enjoying it politically. Maybe not, they're enjoying it personally, but they find it very beneficial, and they would like it to continue. And they're doing nothing meaningful to stop it. And I think that's remarkable because their peoples are suffering, and they're at great risk, both of them, especially the Palestinians, but also the Israelis. This is irresponsible political malpractice of the highest order.
Yeah, Hamas, which when it comes to its messaging, Hamas, when it comes to its messaging, seems to be blurring the lines on what it really wants. Let's listen.
Unfortunately, a copy of the response was leaked to the media before the final draft. I can say that what was discussed in the media is very close to the truth. And we will continue to follow up on the ideas we presented so we can make them happen, God willing.
Okay, so that wasn't really the final list of what we wanted, but it's kind of what we wanted. Sofia Amara, you've just completed a documentary on Hamas.
Where we interviewed Osama Hamdan, who is the Hamas leader in Beirut, Lebanon.
Right, and so first question then, when he's speaking, how much is he really in contact with Yahya Sinwar?
I think he's not. Or at least I think that it has to go through the leadership of Hamas in Qatar, who's using its own way, special way, to be linked.
So it's what we call Chinese whispers. It goes from one person, then a second.
Exactly. And definitely not through modern tools like internet or WhatsApp or whatsoever. So it takes time, first of all. They're under a huge pressure on the ground, militarily speaking. And of course, it's a little bit blurred, as you said. And both of them, both sides, Israelis and Hamas, Netanyahu and Hamas, don't want this war to finish, now, unless they get each one of them a piece of victory, or at least for Netanyahu, he needs many months, because what he wants is Trump to be back. What he wants is his government not to collapse. And we know that with Itamar Ben-Gvir, the right, extreme right or far right wings, they are putting him under pressure. Because you're under war, will make the end of your story. This is for sure politically. So he has many reasons to want a long war. This is not the case for Hamas, but at least Hamas need also to get something in return after having provoked such a humanitarian catastrophe on all these civilians.
But we've seen a beginning of protests against Hamas inside of the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, definitely. But, this is a minority. At the end of the day, a majority, of course, is really pointing out at Israel, at the occupation that led to that situation for 75 years, all the treaties and all the international law resolutions that have been violated continuously with the support of Washington. This is what they point out, not at Hamas. Even though they would like to point at Hamas, they would be scared because we know how Hamas can be brutal even with its own population.
Colin Clark, fast forward to today, and a Hamas delegation back in Cairo, again working on a counter offer for this plan. Again, I ask that we cut through the noise here that we're hearing from both sides. How closer are we to some kind of a truce agreement?
Well, certainly we're hearing some positive things, right? We heard from the Qatari Prime Minister earlier this week that things were moving in the right direction. Look, I'm somebody that when I was at the RAND Corporation, a think tank, we looked at every single insurgency from the end of World War II to 2009. This is not necessarily uncommon. There are ceasefires. There are ceasefires that are broken many times over, dozens of times within one conflict. There are conflicts where we see what we're seeing now, which is what I call fight and talk. And so even if a deal is reached, will it be enough of a confidence-building measure, enough of a stepping stone to a broader political settlement? I think that's the real question. That's what a lot of folks are talking about now. The one thing that worries me is that from the Israeli side, I haven't really seen what a negotiated settlement looks like. We keep hearing, what does the day after look like? And that's where Netanyahu has been reluctant to link the military campaign with a broader political strategy.
Yeah, and you could say exit Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State's fifth trip to the region since October 7th, concluding this Thursday with a little bit of an air of back to the drawing board. Blinken, who before leaving met with Israel's war cabinet, which includes opposition centrists Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot. That meeting with the war cabinet did fire shots across the bow, perhaps, of Netanyahu's hardline stance. Just the fact that he sat down with Gadi Eisenkot and Benny Gantz with the war cabinet, is that, Colin Clark, a subtle or not so subtle way of sending a message to Netanyahu?
I don't think it's subtle whatsoever. And I think it's something that a lot of people in the Beltway here in the United States are talking about. It's something that a lot of people in the national security field are speaking about. Look, if the United States is going to play an integral role in helping bring this conflict to a close, it has to have a willing partner. And right now, you could argue that the United States doesn't have that with Netanyahu. He's completely, unpredictable. And he'll say one thing one day, something the next day. And then when I get into these debates, people say, well, look at Hamas. Look what they're doing. But do you want to compare yourself to a terrorist organization if you're the Israelis? I don't think so. And I think we should have higher standards for our allies in the Middle East. So the U.S. needs a willing partner. If Netanyahu is going to talk out of both sides of his mouth, it's not something that's sustainable for the Biden administration. And I think the Secretary of State's likely very frustrated with what he's saying, which is why he's going and talking to folks like Gantz. He needs a partner.
Yeah, you saw him there in those images with Yair Lapid, another opponent of Benjamin Netanyahu. Exhibit B is some of what the polished Antony Blinken said at his press conference late on Wednesday.
Right.
Dehumanized in the most horrific way on October 7th. The hostages have been dehumanized every day since. But that cannot be a license to dehumanize others.
Charles Freilich, the other night, a reporter in Qatar asked Anthony Blinken if he was too nice for his job. Do Israelis think he's too nice? Is this too subtle, the pressure he's putting on Benjamin Netanyahu?
Look, I have spent just about every weekend in the last few years going to demonstrations against the prime minister. So I am not someone who wishes to be in the position of defending him or his policies. I have been a major critic. The fact is, the state of Israel was attacked in the most vicious manner possible. We always feared that if any piece of Israeli territory was occupied by an Arab force, the population would be slaughtered. That's exactly what happened. Israel is maybe the only country in history that has feared not just politicide, defeat of the state, but genocide. Hamas proved it. We have undergone here a national experience which we will not recover from, unfortunately, for a very long time. And I deeply, deeply, deeply regret to say that I think the expectations that there will be a two-state solution coming out of this are quite unrealistic. We have to go through a period of change, and that's on both sides. I believe it has to be on the Israeli side. It absolutely must be on the Palestinian side. The Palestinians were controlled in Gaza by a radical theocracy, still partly so, and by a dictatorship in the West Bank. They have rejected proposal after proposal for
I want to get back to that, Charles, but my question was more about Anthony Blinken. Do you feel as though the U.S. Secretary of State has been effective?
Well, I think he's been quite effective, and I think he's in a difficult situation wherever he goes in the region. When he talks to the Palestinians, as he did this week, they are a tough partner. When he was in Saudi Arabia, a tough partner. He was in Egypt. Wherever he goes, this is a tough region. And of course, when one is living from media program to media program, people want to see immediate change. It doesn't work that way. It's just not going to happen. If we can come out of this and maybe create a situation in which months or maybe even more than that, but months down the line, we can begin to see a positive change. And I think there will be elections in Israel within a matter of months, and we'll see a centrist government. And then we have to see change on the Palestinian side. Maybe we can start going forward at that point.
Hussein Ibish, right now, what is the street cred of the United States in all of this after 4 months and 1 day?
Well, among the Arab publics, it's below zero, right? In some ways, Washington's reputation has never been lower because while Mr. Freilich says Israelis fear a genocide, Palestinians genuinely believe that the people of Gaza, at least, maybe not the whole Palestinian people, but the people of Gaza are undergoing a kind of genocide right now, and that they fear also ethnic cleansing in present and in the future, both in Gaza and the West Bank. So there's a sense in the Arab world that the United States is not restraining Israel effectively enough. And there's also a sense among keen observers, and now we're switching to governments where all of that anger is offset by a serious commitment to continuing to work with the United States despite all of that. There is a sense that the Israeli military attention is sort of shifting from Gaza north towards Hezbollah. And there's a real fear that Israel is just determined to start a war in Lebanon, and a disastrous one, and that the United States is working hard to restrain Israel, but that it may not be succeeding. And so there's the street cred among the public is terrible and is going to take years to repair. But more importantly, with governments, I think, it depends on the outcome. If the conflict can be contained to Gaza and doesn't spread, especially not at Israel's insistence to involve Hezbollah, then I think the U.S. gets a lot of credit, despite grumbling and dissatisfaction and all of that. If the war continues to fester and metastasize and the region remains totally unstable, Washington fairly or unfairly gets the blame. I agree with Friedrich, that Blinken has been pretty effective under the circumstances, but they're going to have to do something about Israel and Netanyahu, because every version of Plan A for the United States, and there is no Plan B, requires Israel to be open to the eventual creation of a Palestinian state, and to be openly open, to be publicly open to that. And as long as you've got an Israeli government sitting there saying, no way, no how, we're going to reoccupy the West Bank, there's no Palestinian state in the future whatsoever, then the U.S. is blocked, just and restricted to doing little deals, which is probably all that can be done in the coming months. But you need a vision. You need something to work towards, and any version of Plan A depends on Israeli openness to a Palestinian state, an eventual Palestinian state. And there is no Plan B, and that's the problem.
Yeah, you mentioned Lebanon and Yemen, Syria, Iraq, the U.S. forced to manage the spillover effect of a protracted war. Wednesday in Baghdad, the United States killing a senior commander of an Iran-backed militia called Kataib Hezbollah. It's the response to the response of repeated strikes by pro-Tehran militias, including those recent killings of 3 U.S. service members in Jordan. Sofia Mara, you've made several trips recently to Iraq. We've already been talking about Yemen a lot. Is this going to overshadow Yemen?
I don't think so, because Iraq is... it's not in Iraq's interest to go into a bigger and wider confrontation with the U.S., yet it's a very important development that we've seen in the streets of Baghdad, the capital, after there was this attack, which is also very unique, or at least it's the first attack of the Iranian proxies, because it happened in Jordan and killed 3 U.S. soldiers. And this strike is the response to that attack that provoked these 3 military deaths, as an answer from Tehran against what's happening in Gaza. Now, is it efficient? To me, it's not. And this is
what's going to be the response now? What's going to happen next?
I don't know. But yet, Washington really seems really weak in front of what's happening to her in the region. Because, I mean, what has happened in Jordan, which is the killing of 3 military soldiers. This is a proxy who did this, Iranian proxy, but it's the first time it happens in Jordan. It means that this couldn't have happened without a green light from Tehran. And now, instead of, having a harsher answer against the Iranian, they're hitting Iraq. And
this strikes a reminder of the time the Trump administration killed the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Qasem Soleimani, in Baghdad.
Yeah, but it's not the same, because when they killed Qasem Soleimani, that was really harmful for Tehran. Killing Kataib Hezbollah, which are Iraqis, and to Iranians, it's terrible to say so. They're only proxies, They're using them as, it doesn't matter. Qasem Soleimani was a very big loss for the Iranian, not the Kataib Hezbollah militants, and even if he's a leader.
Colin Clark, what are the options in Washington?
Well, this is honestly part of the whole conflict that's not getting enough attention, so I'm glad we're talking about it. This tit for tat between Hashd al-Shaabi, the Iraqi Shia militia groups in the United States, is putting immense pressure on the government in Baghdad. No doubt, the pressure with the Iranians breathing down the neck of government leaders, essentially, urging them to evict the remaining U.S. troops from the country, right? This is something that's bothered Iran for a very long time. If that does happen, if we go down that road, I'm telling you right now, we're going to see a resurgence of the Islamic State in Iraq. They're active in Syria. We've seen recent attacks in both Iran and Turkey. That's not the end of the story. It's a second-order effect of the conflict in Gaza, right? This whole kind of regional conflict with members of the Axis of Resistance, but it's going to have real profound implications for the region.
How so? Because ISIS is not aligned with Tehran.
Correct. They're not aligned with Tehran, but they're certainly going to raise hell in Iraq, as they've done in Syria. So they're hanging out in the central Badia in Syria and bits and pieces along the Syrian-Iraqi border. And it gives them breathing room. It gives them space to regrow their network throughout the Middle East. The United States is serving as a bulwark right now with the troops that they have in Iraq, helping the Iraqis train, advise, assist, keep them at bay. And so I'm very concerned about if those U.S. troops are forced out of the country, what happens there.
And the perception of whether or not the U.S. is weak also because there's a spectacle going on over on Capitol Hill, the U.S. Senate, for the second day running, trying to approve spending for Israel and Ukraine. This time, a $95 billion bill after Republicans blocked an earlier compromised legislation. They've agreed this Thursday, Colin, to send it to the full Senate this second time. But of course, it's anyone's guess what's going to happen there. If legislators don't approve military spending, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I think that's where the optics really kick in, right? Whether we're talking about continued aid to Israel or continued aid to Ukraine, make no mistake, Washington's adversaries are watching and watching closely, both in Moscow and Beijing, right? Because the critique of the United States for a long time is we don't have the staying power. They're not going to be able to see things through, especially across administrations. And so that's what I'll be watching.
Charles Friedrich, is it just political theater seen from Israel, and that at the end of the day, the U.S. will always have Israel's back, or is this gridlock a real problem?
Well, it's a problem because it's holding up the emergency assistance for Israel. But I believe that in the end of the day, the assistance will be approved. We've seen, of course, a great deal of controversy about the war in recent months. And there's certainly been an outbreak of opposition to Israel on the campuses and on the Democratic left. But at the same time, I think that there's some polls that have come out in the last few days, including one out of the Harvard-Harris group, which showed that actually overall American support for Israel and support for its war aims is quite high, and that the American public, unlike some experts in the world, is actually quite capable of differentiating between a war which has costs and various accusations of genocide and other things which really have no bearing in reality. And I would just like to make one more point, which is you've had this banner up for the whole time, Netanyahu vows to keep on fighting in Gaza. How about Hamas vows to keep on fighting forever until Israel's destruction? Might that not have been a similarly appropriate thing to have up there?
It's a question. Hussein Ibish.
I think the bigger question is not aid to Israel, because Chuck Friedrich is right. I mean, it's going to be approved. American support for Israel in the mainstream is very, very strong among the Republican apocalyptic religious fanatics and also among mainstream Democrats who, are reflective of Biden's attitude. So I wouldn't worry about the aid to Israel. It's going to come. The aid to Ukraine is the bigger question, right? Because there you've got a whole posse of quasi-fascistic MAGA Republicans who like Putin. I mean, they actually want Russia to win. It's not just that they don't want to spend money and they have isolationist tendencies. They actually support Russia. And this is a big problem. And they want to play games. They want to, link it to the border, which has nothing to do with Ukraine. So that, I think, is the real problem. And in the Middle East, or at least in the Arab world, I don't think Israel's yet had this problem, which is good for Israel. But especially in the Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, et cetera, the word on Washington that characterizes anxiety about the U.S. is unreliable, right? This is the word that keeps coming up, whether it's in the form of Obama deciding not to enforce his red line against Syrian chemical weapons use in the war there, or Trump not responding to the Iranian attack on Saudi Aramco facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais in 2000, etc. I think there is a sense that the U.S. is very unreliable, and that you can have a United States that in 1 year is full-blown supportive of Ukraine, providing all the weaponry and support necessary to beat back the Russian onslaught. And then a year later, you've got a small group of fanatical Republicans in the House sort of tipping things over and putting the whole future of Ukraine in doubt for no coherent reason other than their fascination with Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. And this is very scary for leaders. That's why the Saudis were so keen and remain keen on a negotiated triangular agreement with Washington and Israel, where they get a treaty of a defense agreement ratified by the Senate in writing that is somewhat immune to presidential whims and congressional whims, that is sort of as set in stone as you can get these kind of agreements, in return for normalization with Israel and all the risks that that would involve, which for Saudi Arabia are considerable. Unlike with the UAE or Bahrain, the Saudis have a lot at stake, so they can't just casually do this, but they would like to. And the big obstacle is going to be, Israel's refusal to accept the Palestinian right to statehood. They don't have to recognize the Palestinian state, but they certainly have to recognize the Palestinian right to a state. They've never done that. And until that happens, it's going to be very, very hard for the Saudis to go ahead. But my point is the Saudis are looking for a way to sort of lock in the United States, as much as possible by getting it in writing and ratified by the Senate. So the whole world, all American allies, I think, are now very afraid that, because there's no consensus in Washington on foreign policy, you can get one policy one year and another completely different policy the next year. Ukraine is a very good example of that. North Korea under Trump, he was in fire and fury one year, and then he was in love, he used to say, literally in love with Kim Jong-un. So it's very, this does not promote a sense of reliability and calm for a great status quo power that's supposed to be protecting stability and security.
Well, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. The Times of Israel this Thursday reported that a meeting hosted by Saudi Arabia of regional foreign ministers was supposed to take place this Thursday. Ministers from Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Qatar, also a top representative from the Palestinian Authority, and the meeting to have less of a security focus, instead revolving more around issues such as those that Charles Friedrich was bringing up earlier, reforming the Palestinian Authority so it's better suited to return to governing Gaza, and coordinating the steps countries are willing to take to boost ties with Israel, namely Saudi Arabia. We don't have confirmation whether or not the meeting took place, but this second track, Colin Clark, to talk about the so-called day after, coming out of Riyadh, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that some of the countries and some of the governments involved in this broader negotiation get it. They understand it. And if the Saudis want potential normalization talks to succeed, this track 2 diplomacy is absolutely essential.
Is it track 2 actually, or is it basically sort of?
It's track 1.5, right? You have these kind of unofficial meetings, and it's called that sometimes, right, in different parts of the world. So I still think very important to iron out some of the wrinkles, and I'm still kind of waiting for some kind of coherent day after strategy, right? Where we're seeing so much focus on the kinetic military campaign, but what happens next? And these negotiated settlements are highly unlikely to succeed unless all of these sticking points are ironed out. And I'd say, probably, more so than almost any other conflict in the world, there's just so much baggage attached to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that there are these issues that are very, very deep and very, very sensitive. And, that's where a lot of this tension is going to manifest. So it's essential that these are ironed out. But I would go back to what Secretary Blinken has said on multiple occasions. This is going to take a long time.
Charles Friedrich, the Saudis are dangling a carrot, it seems.
And I hope it can happen. We all want to see the day after, to see the negotiations get underway. I agree with Colin. I would very much like to see that. The day after doesn't have to come just from Israel. It would be nice if it also came from the Palestinians. I must disagree with one thing that Hussein said, because I agreed with pretty much everything else. But it's not true that Israeli governments have never recognized the Palestinian state. As a matter of fact, they did so on 3 occasions and proposed it twice. Camp David 2000, the Clinton parameters 2000. It was a Palestinian state. Please, Hussein, this is historical fact. And if you'd like, we can invite Dennis Ross to join us in the next broadcast. So that was twice in 2000. It was again in 2008. So there were 3 proposals, 2 of which Israel proposed, a third which it accepted. There has never in the history of the conflict been a Palestinian peace proposal. I think it's time for both of us to put proposals on the table and start getting serious about this. Hussein, give me one example of a Palestinian peace proposal.
There have been scores of Palestinian peace proposals. Like right after Camp David, there was a detailed map that the Palestinians put together right between Camp David when they didn't respond, and that was a huge failure.
Sorry, what year is this? Just to remind our viewers.
2000. Fall of 2000, right? So Camp David was summer of 2000. In the early fall of 2000, right before the Clinton parameters were submitted, the PLO submitted a detailed proposal. They've submitted many proposals. Both sides have refused proposals. But the fact is, Israel has never, in writing on its own, recognized the Palestinian right to a state. That has never happened. The Palestinians did it in a letter by Arafat to Rabin in 1993. And Israel has yet to do that, and it needs to do it. And it needs to do it in an irrevocable way. Irreversible is the word that the Biden administration is using. Let me say 2 things about this meeting in Saudi Arabia, which I assume is happening. One is it's necessary for the Arabs to act in concert with each other. They don't have enough heft because none of them have a lot of leverage with Hamas except for Qatar, which is a small and exposed state, and it needs to work in partnership with Saudi Arabia and even the UAE, countries it has really disagreed with in the past. They need Qatar, Qatar needs them. They all need to work with the Egyptians, and so the Arab world is finding it necessary to come together in a way that's unusual and that's actually healthy for them. It's good for them to do that. The second thing is that there is an interesting convergence of Arab, at least normative Arab, and Western, at least normative Western, thinking on the day after. And it all revolves around fixing the PA, reforming the PA. The PA is a wretched institution because it's like Frankenstein's monster. It's stitched together from corpses of other things. And it outlived its sell-by date in 1998. It was only supposed to exist for 5 years and be a transitionary body. It's a wreck. So it needs to be fixed in terms of its political culture and structure and corruption and all that, but also in terms of what is it there for? What is it supposed to do? It needs a new identity vis-a-vis Israel, and there has to be a horizon for independence to make the PA make sense. Otherwise, it's just a bizarre, meaningless organization. So I think the Americans and the Arabs are starting to think in terms of focusing on normalizing with Israel and integrating Israel into the region, at the same time making a Palestinian state eventually an irreversible necessity. And for that, they're coming together, and that's great. Israel has to come along.
For Sophia Amara, very quickly, the Qataris, according to those reports, invited this time to Riyadh.
It's a new strategy because normally,
in the past, they've been feuding those
Qatari were never invited.
So how much leverage does Qatar have today when it comes to Hamas?
It does, but it's not the question. The question is who has.
Could they cut off Yahya Sinwar if they wanted to?
No. And at the same time, the question is who has leverage on Israel? It's not on the Hamas. Hamas is, being fought on the ground today in Gaza. We don't know where this is going to lead us. And I don't agree at all with what was said, that Hamas, as well as Israel, has interest for this war to go on forever, which is totally wrong, because Hamas doesn't have the military will and support, U.S. support, to keep on fighting. This is first of all. Second, this meeting in Riyadh is like, it's really one of the element of this chaos, diplomatic chaos. They're preparing the aftermath the day after, whereas the war is still going on. And the day after with
So they're putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, the KSA, who wants to make peace with Israel and make sure that there is a PA, which is a Palestinian authority, so that it has an excuse to do the peace with Israel. And normally you make peace with your enemy. I'm talking about Israel. They should do peace with Palestinians before running after the KSA. You know what I mean? Now, I don't agree with one last thing. It's not because there was a peace agreement that on the ground it's possible to play that peace agreement. I'm back from the occupied West Bank, and I have seen how much it's impossible for the Palestinian to use their lands in the West Bank, that even the Class A territories, it's a bit technical and complicated.
Yeah. Especially because we're out of time.
Yeah, I know. But, and where I saw just people who couldn't work on their land to cultivate olives. And so, peace is not enough. It has to be on the ground. So this is not true. And I think what should happen, the problem is not Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel. I think there is a big problem in looking at the issue. It's not Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel who are not consistent. It's not a problem. They have never been. Netanyahu have never been. Or he've always said the same thing. No Palestinian state. We back up Hamas. We pay Hamas, and we divide the Palestinian. The problem is the U.S. When will it be consistent enough?
When will it be consistent?
To say, you guys, you have to make peace. That's it.
We'll have to leave it there. Sophia Amara, I want to thank you. I want to thank so much Charles Frelich for being with us from Tel Aviv, Colin Clark in Pittsburgh, Hussein Ibish in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.